Hello everyone and welcome back to part 6 of the series on Babylonia and the Assyrians. As always, if you are following along and you like the content, then give it a like and subscribe, and do click the bell button so you know when the next part comes out. We wouldn't want you to miss anything now, wouldn't we? Now, introductions out of the way, we all know why we're here. Today we're talking about the moneylender and banking system. As always, the most popular people of ancient and modern times. Well, let's see how they dealt with it back in ancient Babylonia. Among the professions of ancient Babylonia, moneylending held a foremost place. It was, in fact, one of the most lucrative of professions, and was followed by all classes of the population, the highest as well as the lowest. Members of the royal family did not disdain to lend money at high rates of interest, receiving as security for it various kinds of property. It is true that in such cases the business was managed by an agent, but the lender of the money, and not the agent, was responsible for all the consequences of their action, and it was to him that all the profits went. So the moneylender, it was basically the banker of antiquity. In a trading community like that of Babylonia, where actual coin was comparatively scarce at the time, and the gigantic system of credit which prevails in the modern world has not yet come into existence, it was pretty much impossible to do without the moneylender. The taxes had to be paid in cash, you see, which was required by the government for the payment of a standing army and a large body of officials. The same causes which have thrown the fellahim of modern Egypt into the hands of Greek usurers were at work in ancient Babylonia. Well, in some instances, the moneylender founded a business which lasted a number of generations and brought a large part of the property of the country into the possessions of the firm. This was notably the case with the great firm of Agibi, established at Babylon before the time of Sennacherib, which in the age of the Babylonian Empire and the Persian conquest became effectively the Rothschilds of the ancient world. It lent money to the state as well as to individuals. It undertook agencies for private persons and eventually absorbed a good deal of what was properly attorney's business. Deed and other legal documents belonging to others, as well as to members of the firm, were lodged for security in its record chambers, stored in great earthenware jars which served as kind of like safes. The larger part of the contract tablets from which our knowledge of social life of later Babylonia is derived has come from the officers of this firm. In the early days of Babylonia, the interest upon a loan was to be paid in kind. But the introduction of a circulating medium goes back to an ancient date, and it was not long before the payment in grain or other crops was replaced by its equivalent in cash. Already, before the days of Amraphel and Abraham, we find contracts stipulating for the payment of so many silver shekels per month upon each money lent to the borrower. Thus we have one written in Semitic Babylonian, and it reads, Kisnunu, the son of Imur-Sin, has received 1 money and a half of silver from Zikilum, in which he will pay 12 shekels of silver a month. The capital and interest are to be paid on the day of the harvest as guaranteed. Dated the year when Imergum dug the Asuki Canal. Then follow the names of 3 witnesses, as is custom with all Babylonian contracts. The obligation to repay the loan on the day of the harvest is a survival from a time when all payments were in kind, and the creditor had a right to first fruits of the debtor's property. A contract dated in the reign of Hammurabi, or Amraphel, similarly stipulates that interest on a loan made to a certain Arad Elisu by one of the female devotees of the sun god should be paid into the treasury of the temple at Samas on the day of the harvest. Now the interest was reckoned at so much per month, as in the East today. Originally, it had to be paid by the end of each month, according to the literal terms of the agreement. But as time went on, it became usual to reserve the payments to end of 6 months or a year. It was only where the debtor was not considered trustworthy, or the security was insufficient, that the literal interpretation of the agreement was absolutely insisted upon. Of course, the rate of interest, as was natural, tended to be lower with the lapse of time and the growth of wealth. In the age of the Babylonian Empire and the Persian conquest, the normal rate was, however, still as high as 1 shekel a month upon each money, or in layman's terms, 20%. But we have a contract dated in the 5th year of Nebuchadnezzar, in which a talent of silver is lent, and the interest charge upon it is not more than half a shekel per month on the money, or 10%. 3 years later, in another contract, the rate of interest is stated to be 5/6 of a shekel, or 16 2/3%, while in the 15th year of Shamash Sum-Yukin, the interest upon the loan of 16 shekels is only 1/4 of a shekel. At this time, Babylonia was suffering from the results of its revolt from Assyria, which may explain the lowness of the rate of interest. At all events, 6 years later, Remut, one of the members of the Agibi firm, lent a sum of money to a man and his wife without charging any interest at all, and stipulating only that the money should be repaid when the land was again prosperous. There were times, however, money was lent upon the understanding that interest would be charged only if it were not repaid by a specified date. Thus, in the 9th year of Shamash Sum-Yukin, half a money was lent by Suma to Tukbenu on the 4th of March Esvan, or October in our modern reckoning, upon which no interest was to be paid up to the end of the following Tisri, or September, which corresponded with the day of the harvest of older contracts. But after that, if the money was still unpaid, interest at the rate of half a shekel a month, or 10%, would be charged. At other times, the interest was paid by the year, as with us, and not by the month. In this case, it was a lower rate than the normal 20%. In the 14th year of Nabopolassar, for example, a manet of silver was lent at the rate of 7 shekels on each manet per annum, that is to say at 11 2/3%, and under Nebuchadnezzar, money was borrowed at annual interest of 8 shekels for each manet, or 13 1/3%. Full security was taken for a loan, and the contract relating to it attested by a number of witnesses. Thus the following contract was drawn up in the 3rd year of Nabonidus, a loan of a manet of silver, having been made by one of the members of the Agibi firm to a man and his wife. It goes as following. 1 manet of silver, the property of Nadin Merodach, the son of Ikisabel, the son of Nur-Sin, has been received by Nebo Baladan, the son of Nadin Sumi, and Bau-ed-Herat, the daughter of Shamash-Ebus. In the month of Tisri, September, they shall repay the money and the interest upon it. Their upper field, which adjoins that of Sum-Yukin, the son of Sa-Nebo-Su, as well as the lower field which forms the boundaries of the house of the seer, and is planted with palm trees and grass, is the security of Nadin-Merodach, to which, in the case of insolvency, he shall have the first claim. No other creditor shall take possession of it until Nadin-Merodach has received in full the capital and interest. In the month Tisri, the dates which are then ripe upon the palms shall be valued, and according to the current price of them at the time in the town of Sakrin, Nadin-Merodach shall accept them instead of interest at the rate of 36 cars, 50 quarts, the shekel. The money is intended to pay the tax for providing the soldiers of the king of Babylon with arms. Witnessed by Nebo-Bel-Sunu, the son of Bau-Aki, son of Dahik, Nebo-Diniebus, the son of Kinenuna, Nebo-Zira-Usabsi, the son Samas ibn Bazuzu, the son of Shamas ibn Merodach-Erba, son of Nadin, and the scribe Bel-Idin, dated at Sakrini, the 28th day of Iyar, April, the 3rd year of Nabonidus, king of Babylon. In Assyria, the rate of interest was a good deal higher than it was in Babylonia. It is true that in a contract dated 667 BC, one of the parties, which was the son of the secretary of the municipality of Dur-Sargon, the modern Khorsabad, it is 20%, as in Babylonia, but this is almost the only case where it is so. Elsewhere, in the deeds dated 684 and 656 BC and later, the rate is as much as 25%, while in one instance, a deed dated 711 BC, it rises to 33.33%. Among the witnesses to the last mentioned deed are 2 smiths, one of whom is described as a copper smith, and the other bears the Armenian name of Siduri or Sarduris. The money is usually reckoned in according to the standard of Carchemish. That the rate of interest should have been higher in Assyria than in Babylonia is not surprising. Commerce was quite a bit less developed there, and the attention of the population was devoted rather to war and agriculture than it was to trade. It seems to have been the conquest of Western Asia, the subjugation of the Phoenician cities, and above all the incorporation of Babylonia in the empire, which introduced a commercial spirit into Nineveh, and made it in latter days of its existence an important center of trade. Indeed, one of the objects of the Assyrian campaigns in Syria was to divert the trade of the Mediterranean into the hands of Assyrians. The fall of Carchemish made Assyria mistress of the caravan road which led across the Euphrates, and of the commerce which had flowed from Asia Minor, while the ruin of Tyre and Sidon meant prosperity to the merchants of Nineveh. Nevertheless, the native population of Assyria was slow to avail itself of the commercial advantages which had fallen to it, and a large part of its trading classes were Aramaeans, or other foreigners who had settled in the country. So large indeed was the share in Assyrian trade which the Aramaeans absorbed that Aramaic became the lingua franca, the common medium of intercommunication, in the commercial world of the Second Assyrian Empire, and, has already been stated, many of the Assyrian contractual tablets are provided with Aramaic dockets, which give a brief abstract of their contents. A memorandum signed by Basia, the son of Riki, as it is quoted, furnishes us with the relative value of gold and silver in the age of Nebuchadnezzar. It goes like this: 2 shekels and a quarter of gold for 25 shekels and 3/4 of silver, 1 shekel worn and deficient in weight, for 7 shekels of silver, 2 1/4 shekels also worn, for 22 3/4 shekels of silver. In all, 5½ shekels of gold for 55½ shekels of silver. Gold, therefore, at this time, would have been worth about 11 times more than silver. A few years later, however, in the 11th year of Nabonidus, the proportion has risen and was 12-1. Now we learn this from a statement that the goldsmith Nebo Eder Napisti, if I'm pronouncing that difficult one right, had received in that year, on the 10th day of Ab, 1 shekel of gold in 5 shekel pieces for 12 shekels of silver. Now the coinage, if we may use such a term, was the same in both metals, the talent being divided into 60 manes and the mane into 60 shekels. There seems also to have been a bronze coinage, at all events in the later age of Assyria and Babylonia, but the references to it are very rare. And silver was pretty much the ordinary medium of exchange. One of the contract tablets, however, which have come from Assyria and is dated in the year 676 BC, relates to the loan of 2 talents of bronze from the treasury of Ishtar at Arbela, which were to be repaid 2 months afterwards. Failing this, interest was to be charged upon them at a rate of 33 1/3%, and it is implied that the payment was to be in bronze. The talent, mane, and shekel were originally weights, and had been adopted by the Semites from their Sumerian predecessors. They form part of that system of numeration which lay at the root of Babylonian mathematics, and was as old as the invention of writing itself. So thoroughly was this system based on the number 60 regarded as the unit of calculation that it was denoted by the same single wedge or upright line as which stood for 1. Wherever the system based on the number 60 prevailed, we may see an evidence of the influence of Babylonian culture. This is also a system that's called the sexagesimal system. It was the mane, however, not the talent, which was adopted as the standard. The talent, in fact, was too heavy for such a purpose. It implied too considerable amount of precious metal, and was too seldom employed in the daily business of life. The Babylonian, accordingly, counted up from the mane to the talent, and down to the shekel. The standard weight of the mane, which continued in use up to the latest days of Babylonian history, had been fixed by Dungi of the dynasty of Ur, about 2700 BC. An inscription on a large cone of green stone, now in the British Museum, tells us that the cone represents 1 mane standard weight, the property of Merodach-Sar-Ilani, and a duplicate of the weight which Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, the son of Nabopolassar, king of Babylon, had made in exact imitation of the standard of weight established by the deified Dungi, that earlier king. The stone now weighs 978.309 grams, which, making the requisite deductions for the wear and tear of time, would give us about 980 grams, or rather more than 2 pounds 2 ounces. The Babylonian money, as fixed by Dungi and Nebuchadnezzar, thus agrees in weight rather with the Hebrew money of gold than with the royal, as it is called, money, which is equivalent to 2 pounds 7.5 ounces. It was not, however, the only money in use in Babylonia. Besides the heavy or royal money, there was also a light money, like the Hebrew silver money of 1 pound 11 ounces, while the Assyrian contract tablets make mention of the money of Carchemish, which was introduced into Assyria after the conquest of the Hittite capital in 717 BC. It's been pointed out that this later money was known in Asia Minor, as far as the shores of the Aegean, and that the tongues or bars of silver found by Dr. Schliemann on the site of Troy are shekels made in accordance with it. That is in reference to Heinrich Schliemann. A similar tongue of gold, as it's referred to, of 50 shekels weight, is referred to in the book of Josh, in connection with that goodly Babylonian garment which was carried away by Achan from among the spoils of Jericho. It is probable that the shekels and manes of Babylonia were originally cast in the same tongue-like form. In Egypt, they were in the shape of rings and spirals, but there is no evidence that the use of the latter extended beyond the valley of the Nile. In Western Asia, it was rather bars of metal that were employed. At first, the value of the bar had to be determined by its being weighed each time that it changed hands, but it soon came to be stamped with an official indication of its weight and value. A Cappadocian tablet found near Caesarea, I beg your pardon, excuse me, which is the least early as the age of Exodus, may go back to that of Abraham. It speaks of 3 shekels of sealed or stamped silver. In that distant colony of Babylonian civilization, therefore, an official seal was already put upon some of the money in circulation. In the time of Nebuchadnezzar, the coinage was still more advanced. There were single shekel pieces of 5 shekels and the like, all implying that coins were issued representing different fractions of the money. The money itself was divided into pieces of 5 shekels, 5/6 rather, 2/3, 1/3, 1/2, 1/4, and 3/4. It is often specified whether a sum of money is to be paid in a single shekel pieces or in 5 shekel pieces, and the word stamped is sometimes added. The invention of regular coinage is generally ascribed to the Lydians, but it is more probably due to the Babylonians, from whom Lydians and Greeks derived their systems of weights, as well as the term mina, which they turned into mane. The Agibi firm was not the only great banking or trading establishment of which we know in ancient Babylon. The American excavators at Nefer have brought to light records of another firm, that of Murasu, which, although established in a provincial town and not in the capital, rose to a position of great wealth and influence under the Persian kings Artaxerxes I and Darius II, Artaxerxes ruling from 464 to 424, and Darius II 424 to 405 BC. These tablets found at Tello also indicate the existence of similarly important trading firms in the Babylonia of 2700 BC. Though in this period, trade was chiefly confined to home products: cattle, sheep, wool and grain, dates and bitumen, things of the like. Now, the learned professions were also very well represented. The scribes were a large and powerful body, and in Assyria, where education was less widely diffused rather than in Babylonia, they formed a considerable part of the governing bureaucracy. In Babylonia, they acted as librarians, authors, and even publishers, multiplying copies of older books and adding them new works of their own. They served also as clerks and secretaries. They drew up documents of state as well as legal contracts and deeds. They were accordingly responsible for the forms of legal procedure, and so to some extent occupied the place of the barristers and attorneys of our modern day, if we are going to draw a comparison. The Babylonian seems usually, if not always, to have pleaded his own case, but his statement of it was thrown into shape by the scribe or clerk, like the final decision of the judges themselves. Under Nebuchadnezzar and his successors, such clerks were called the scribes of the king, and were probably paid out of the public revenues. Thus, in the second year of Evil-Merodach, it is said that of the claimants to an inheritance, they shall speak to the scribes of the king and seal the deed, and the seller of some land has to take the deed of quittance to the scribes of the king, who shall supervise and seal it to the city. Many of the scribes were priests, and it is not uncommon to find the clerk who draws up a contract and appears as a witness to be described as the priest of some deity. The physician is mentioned at a very early date. Thus we hear of Elu Bani, the physician of Gudea, the high priest of Lagash, 2700 BC, and a treatise on medicine, of which fragments exist in the British Museum, was compiled long before the days of Abraham. It continued to be regarded as a standard work on the subject, even in the time of the Second Assyrian Empire, though its prescriptions are mixed up with charms and incantations. But an attempt was made in it to classify and describe various diseases, and to enumerate the remedies that have been proposed for them. The remedies are often a compound of the most heterogeneous drugs, some of which are of a very unsavory nature, of course. However, the patient or his doctor is generally given the choice of what remedies he might adopt. Thus, for an attack of spleen, he was told either to slice the seed of a reed and dates in palm wine, or to mix calf's milk and bitters in palm wine, or perhaps to drink garlic and bitters in palm wine. For an aching tooth, it is laid down the plant of human destiny, perhaps the mandrake, is the remedy. It must be placed upon the tooth. The fruit of yellow snakewort is another remedy for an aching tooth. It must be placed upon it. The roots of a thorn, which does not see the sun when growing, is another remedy for an aching tooth. It must be placed upon it. Unfortunately, it's still impossible to assign a precise signification to most of the drugs that are named, or to identify the various herbs contained in the Babylonian pharmacopoeia. Well, as time passed on, the charms and other superstitious practices which had at first played so large a part in Babylonian medicine seemed to have fallen into the background and were abandoned, at least to the more educated classes of society. The conquest of Western Asia by the Egyptian pharaohs of the 18th dynasty brought Babylonia into contact with Egypt, where the art of medicine was already far advanced. It is probable that from this time forward, Babylonian medicine also became more strictly scientifically based. We have indeed evidence that the medicinal system and practice of Egypt had been introduced into Asia. When the great Egyptian treatise on medicine, known as the Papyrus Ebers, was written in the 16th century BC, one of the most fashionable occultists of the day was a Syrian of Gebal, and as the study of the disease of the eye was peculiarly Egyptian, we must assume that his science had been derived from the valley of the Nile itself. It must not be supposed, however, that these superstitious beliefs and practices of the past were altogether abandoned, even by the most distinguished practitioners, any more than they were by the physicians of Europe in the early part of our last century. But they were invoked only when the ordinary remedies had failed, and when no resource seemed left except the aid of spiritual power. Otherwise, the doctor depended on his diagnosis of the disease and the prescriptions which had been accumulated by the experience of past generations. At the head of the profession stood the court physician, the Rab Mugi, or Rabmag as he was called in Babylonia. In Assyria, there was more than one doctor attached to the royal person, but the letters have come down to us from which we learn that royal physicians were at times permitted to attend private individuals when they were sick. Thus we have a letter of thanks to the Assyrian king from one of his subjects, full of gratitude to the king for sending his own doctor to the writer, who had accordingly been cured of a dangerous disease. It goes as following. May Ishtar of Erech and Nana of Bit Anu grant long life to the king my lord, for he has sent Basa, the royal physician, to save my life, and he has cured me. May the great gods of heaven and earth be therefore gracious to the king my lord, and may they establish the throne of the king my lord in heaven forever, since I was dead, and the king has restored me to life. Another letter contains a petition that one of the royal physicians should be allowed to visit a lady who was ill. It goes as following. To the king my lord, thy servant Sol Miti Yabulid sends salutation to the king my lord. May Nebo and Merodach be gracious of the king my lord forever and ever. Baal Gamilat, the handmaid of the king, is constantly ill. She cannot eat a morsel of food. Let the king send orders that some physician may go and see her. In this case, however, it is possible that the lady, who seems to have been suffering from consumption, belonged to the harem of the monarch, and it was consequently needful to obtain royal permission for a stranger to visit her, even though he came professionally. Well, we can hardly reckon among Babylonian professions that of the poet. It is true that a sort of poet laureate existed at the court, and that we hear of a piece of land being given by the king to one of them for several verses which he composed in honor of the sovereign. But poetry was not a separate profession, and the poet must be inclined included in the class of scribes, or among those educated country gentlemen who possess estates of their own. He was, however, fully appreciated in Babylonia. The names of the chief poets of the country were never forgotten, and the poems they had written passed through edition after edition down to the later days of Babylonian history. Now, Sin Liki Unini, the purported author of the Epic of Gilgamesh, Nis Sin, the author of Adventures of Etana, and many others, never passed out of literary remembrance. There was a large reading public, and literary language of Babylonia changed but little from century to century. It was otherwise with the musicians. They formed a class unto themselves, though whether as a trade or as a profession, well, that's difficult to say. We must, however, distinguish between the composer and the performer. The latter was frequently a slave or a captive, and occupied but a humble place in society. He is frequently depicted in the Assyrian bas-reliefs, and in one instance is represented as wearing a cap of great height and shaped like a fish. Musical instruments were numerous and various. We find among them drums and tambourines, trumpets and horns, lyres, harps and zithers, pipes and cymbals. Even the speaking trumpet was employed. In a sculpture which represents the transport of a colossal bull from the quarries of Balad to the palace of Sennacherib, an overseer is made to stand on the body of the bull and issue orders through a trumpet to the workmen. Besides single musicians, there were bands of performers, and at times the music was accompanied by dancing or clapping of the hands. The bands were under the conduct of leaders, who kept time with a double rod. In one instance, the Assyrian artist has represented 3 captives playing on a lyre, an interesting illustration of the complaint of the Jewish exiles in Babylonia that their conquerors required them to perform a song. The artist fared no better than the musical performer, the painter of the figurines and scenes on the walls of the chamber, the sculptor of the bas-reliefs which adorned the Assyrian palace, or of the statues which stood in the temples of Babylonia, the engraver of the gems and seals, some of which show high artistic talent, were all alike skilled artisans, and nothing more. We have already seen what wages they received, and what consequently must have been the social admiration in which they were held. Behind the workman, however, stood the original artist, who conceived and drew the first designs, and to whom the artistic inspiration was primarily due. Of him we still know nothing. Probably he belonged in general to the class of priests or scribes, and would have disdained to receive remuneration for his art. As yet, the texts have thrown no light upon him, and it may be that they will never do so. The Babylonians were a practical, not an artistic people, and the skilled artisan gave them all that they demanded in the matter of art, nothing more, nothing less. Okay, well, that is the end of this installment into ancient Babylonia. I hope it was all that you expected. So I thank my top tier patrons and subscribers on YouTube: Dark, Kerry, Kimberly, Ember, Ben, Britt, Charles, Erin, James, Jeffrey, Melissa, Scott, Stark Factory, Wendy, Jaden, Sherry, Jessica, Christine, Sally, Katiana, Christine, Fazabo, Legitimus, Maverick, Susan, Dr. Neuro, Nerd, Cameron, Alexander, Nicholas, Daniel, JR, and Charlene. Thank you very much, and I will see you on the next exciting episode. Good night, everyone. Lots of love to each and every one of you.